It's a special edition of the Brian Lehrer Show, live in the Greene Space, WNYC's ground floor theater here on Varick Street in Lower Manhattan. If you are listening on the radio, I would invite you all down, except that we have a full house already. Seems like a great audience. Everybody give the person next to you a round of applause for coming here today. And, oh, you really like each other. And we've got a great lineup, both for people here in the theater and for all of you listening on the radio. Are you ready? MSNBC host Jolie Reid will talk about the presidential race, including in the context of her book, Fracture, which is about race in America as seen through the relationship between the Obamas and the Clintons. Yesterday, that relationship was like a buddy film. And we have a clip of Michelle Obama that we'll play eventually. Jolie Reid coming up second today. Also, the artist will be present. Marina Abramovich, best known for her MoMA performance art piece, in which people could come and just sit silently as they and Marina just look at each other. Marina Abramovich with a new memoir and a being present exercise that we can all do together. And our New Jersey Public Radio editor, Nancy Solomon, and reporter Matt Katz. Yes, it's a Bridgegate update right here in the Greene Space, as the Bridgegate trial is supposed to be in closing arguments today after a mysterious temporary adjournment yesterday. Time for some legal problems in Fort Lee. But we begin as usual on Fridays with our weekly Ask the Mayor segment with Mayor Bill de Blasio. Our main focus today will be where the city is at, with tomorrow being the 4th anniversary of Sandy hitting our shores. Listeners on the radio, if you have a Sandy-related question today, you're invited to call in to 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. This can be about your own house in the Build It Back program, or about resiliency policy, or anything Sandy-related at 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692, or use the Twitter hashtag AskTheMayor. The mayor, who is with us live right here on the Greene Space stage. Please welcome the mayor.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
And hi, Mr. Mayor. You're very tall.
Yes, Brian, you're an insightful journalist. Often said that.
And you got a nice reception from the audience there, but that's always a variable for an elected official, right? Like, I've seen you, and I've seen lots of elected officials from both parties, it's not about you, get booed, like when they throw out the first pitch at a ball game and other public appearances. And that's politics, I guess. Do you cringe when you're being introduced before a crowd?
No. The ball game is just wonderfully generic. I was reading a book by Tip O'Neill the other day, and he had one of his axioms for public life is do not throw out a pitch at a ball game, because you're just going to, it doesn't matter who you are. You're going to be booed if you're anyone who's elected. And that's cool. That's people sort of getting their feelings out and moving on with their lives, and also they'd rather watch a ball game than an elected official, but which I can relate to. But no, I think, the great thing about democracy is you come out there and you have a conversation with people, and I actually have tremendous respect for the discernment capacity of the public. So sometimes they'll boo, sometimes they'll cheer. That's cool.
How about at a town hall meeting? For example, I moderated one at NJPAC on education when Cory Booker was mayor of Newark. And a few thousand people were there, kind of self-selecting mostly by those who disagreed with him on education policy. And periodically, the mayor would just get booed and jeered for something that he said. What do you do when it's in your face like that and you're actually there, not ceremonially like at a ballgame, but because of a difficult issue?
You just go on with your life. When I was a city council member in Brooklyn, I many times, for example, got up in front of town halls and said, here's why we need affordable housing in the neighborhood. And there was always a vocal faction who opposed any affordable housing. And some of that was concern about, not wanting height in the neighborhood. Some of that was some less noble concerns. And I expected people to boo. I expected people to challenge. And I said, look, this is what I ran on. You elected me. I'm going to do it. I'll listen to you. I'll work with you. But I'm going to do what I said I was going to do. And you have to be resolute, and you have to have the courage of your own convictions. But, booing comes with the territory. We had a town hall meeting in the South Bronx last night. And what was so striking to me is it wasn't organized constituencies. It was hundreds of people from the neighborhood, folks from public housing, folks who have been involved in dealing with so many of the challenges that the South Bronx had over decades and stood and fought and kept their neighborhood together. And those dialogues went on for about 3 hours last night, and anyone could ask whatever they want, and it was very life-affirming, because people, the public has serious, thoughtful questions they want to ask, and they're actually searching for answers. And if you don't play a game with it, meaning if you give them level, straightforward answers, including some things they don't want to hear, I find the vast majority of New Yorkers respect that.
All right, well, let's go on to one of those difficult topics, our main topic for today, Sandy and the city 4 years later. Tomorrow, the 4th anniversary of the day that Sandy hit, and unfortunately, many people's homes remain unrepaired under the city's Build It Back program, which you promised last year would be completed by the end of this year. Now you acknowledge it won't. What went wrong?
Well, let me first give you the overview. When I came into office, there have been no construction starts on anyone's home, and there have been no reimbursement checks for anyone who was owed support under Build It Back. Today, right now, we project about 84% of the folks in the program either have had a construction start or have gotten a check. The area where we're not doing well enough is on the actual rebuildings. We do project 75% of those will be complete by the end of the year. 90% of those buildings will be started by the end of the year. So we did not hit the goal I wanted, but I want to say still a lot of work got done, and I don't regret setting that goal, Brian. I think it was a way to jolt forward the bureaucracy. It was a way to get everyone moving very quickly and getting all the different agencies, including the utilities and everyone we had to get involved, the private contractors. It sent a message to everyone that I was holding them accountable, and I did. We didn't get as far as I wanted. Now, the good news is a lot of work is going on right now, and we're going to get more and more done in not only the months leading up to December 31st, but in January we'll keep going, in February we'll keep going. We're going to get more and more people back in their home. The big point here, though, is I think we've come to the conclusion that this was not the right model from the beginning. We're going to do a formal evaluation. We're going to bring in some experts. But I want to be blunt with everyone. We're living in a world because of climate change where we have to assume something like this might happen again. Thank God it hasn't since Sandy, but we have to be ready for it again. When and if we ever cross that bridge and we get to that moment again, we're not using this model. It's too cumbersome. It puts the government in the position, the city government in the position of building homes, which the city government is not good at, single-family homes. We've got to find a different approach. And I think we're learning some tough lessons. But again, thank God, by the end of the year, at least 75% of those folks will be back in their homes, the others soon after.
Like what kind of different approach?
Well, look, I think a lot of other jurisdictions, including the state of New York, favored the notion of providing direct financial support to the homeowners and letting them take personal responsibility for whatever timeline they wanted to go on and approach. And I think that may be wiser. We'll analyze it. But what we found that there were so many moving parts, so many city agencies, the private contractors, the utilities, that the city trying to do something it just doesn't have a history of doing. I mean, the city does build big buildings. It does not build single-family homes, and it proved not to be that great at it. So my sense is we'll look at a way just to empower homeowners in the future with the resources they need as quickly as possible and support them in doing what they want to do.
Couple of details of Build It Back because people are still stuck in this system. Our infrastructure reporter Matthew Sherman had a piece on Morning Edition today saying one of the problems with having an unrealistic citywide deadline has been that the city has been pushing the homeowners too hard to meet deadlines of their own, like to sign contracts for work that wasn't yet properly designed, just so the work could get pushed forward and done on time, even with the blueprints still being redone, as in a case that was profiled in the piece. Is your understanding, too, that there have been consequences for people of trying to move quickly?
Yeah, I want to disagree with that analysis. I'm sure there's been some examples where there were problems, and there's certainly been hardship cases, Brian, for sure. And we have recognized those hardships. Some folks end up in the hospital or other family tragedies, and we've certainly given people more time for that. But look, here's another thing I think was wrong with this vision from the beginning. If you're saying we want the government to fix this problem, spend public money to put these homes together, and we want to do it fast, then homeowners don't get to constantly delay the process because of their own preferences. You either are in a program where you're wanting us to move fast and get things done, or, as I said, I think where we're going to go in the future is just give you the resources. If you want to do it in 1 year, if you want to do it in 10 years, that's up to you. We are, just one very important point, we are making clear to homeowners that there is an option now to still take direct funding, and that amount has gone up substantially, if they want to convert to that model of just taking the money and doing their own plans. And we're talking to homeowners right now about whether they would prefer that option at this point. But no, I believe what happened is we created kind of the worst of all worlds. We created a situation where there was lots of homeowner choice and slow deadlines, and it kept everything moving slowly when what we needed was an aggressive timeline for everyone's good. The people kept saying they wanted this done. If you want it done, you can't have endless delays on every choice. Like everything else in life, there need to be deadlines.
And the cover of the Daily News today is a big headline, Sandy Ripoff, and says they found that for the 33 public housing developments affected by Sandy, recovery consultants are running up costs on hotels, flights, limos, Uber, even laundry bills. Last December alone, the article says, 49 hotel nights, some of them for non-work days, allowed under the contract, 19 airline flights, and the lead consultant billing some of this the lead consultant himself is from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. NYCHA couldn't find a New Yorker to do this?
Yeah, Brian, be careful what you read in the tabloids. I have warned you about this before. Our dear friends in the tabloids sometimes do not do their fact-checking. These consultants were part of a group that won for the City of New York and for the Housing Authority the largest FEMA grant award in the history of FEMA. It's almost $3 billion. To get the money from FEMA is a very exacting process. Why does that consultant come from Louisiana? Well, I think it's fair to say Louisiana went through this before we went through this, and there's a very specific way you go about. When you're asking someone, just think about this in your own life. If you're asking someone for $3 billion, they tend to be very picky, and they want a lot of proof.
Even the federal government.
Even the federal government. And so we are thrilled with the work that got done. And yeah, if you bring a consultant from out of town, of course there are expenses related to it. But the amount of money that's now flowing into this city, it's going to be something so important, because with public housing, we're not only going to be able to fix what was broken, we're actually going to be able to improve buildings in the process and make them better than they were, and that's crucial.
All right. Now, I think we have some listeners on the phone with questions about Sandy. We're going to take some non-Sandy questions from listeners, from people in the audience here at the Greene Space.
They're no longer listeners when they're here. They're people, Brian.
That's right. Now they're people.
You've gotten an upgrade. You are now people.
You're viewers. You're, I don't know what. You're interactors.
Viewers. Brian, I think this terminology is coming unhinged.
Flesh pressers.
How can they be viewers if we're on radio?
Well, no, the viewers, they're here.
They're viewing us.
Space. They're viewing us.
But we're still on radio.
I'm not getting into this argument with you.
Now he knows what it feels like.
We're on social media. And we're out there. By the way, I guess this is another thing that happens when you're the mayor, and I'll set the scene for the listeners. There is a protest going outside, and people are waving some kinds of placards visible to us here from the stage, not visible to the audience because they're facing away from it. Do you know who the protesters are, and will you comment on their issue?
It is the PBA, the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, and they like to go different places I go and protest, and I'll just state the obvious. All of our uniform service unions in this city, there are 4 other unions who represent members of the NYPD, lieutenants, detectives, captains, sergeants. There are unions that represent firefighters, correction officers, sanitation workers. All of those unions are under contract with the City of New York. All of them came to the bargaining table, and we struck a compromise and came under contract. The correction workers, sanitation workers, firefighters all have disability coverage for all their members because they worked with the City of New York on the give and take it takes to get to an agreement. The only union that does not have a collective bargaining agreement or disability for its younger workers is the PBA, because they consistently refuse to negotiate. And that's their choice. So they can pick it all they want, but the door is always open to them and any other union that wants to come to the table and respect the needs of the taxpayers of the City of New York, the people of the City of New York, and of course the needs of the workers. We want to have that dialogue, but only one union is standing apart in this city right now.
All right. Well, I guess after that we'll invite Pat Lynch, the head of the PBA, to come and give his side on a future show. All right, let's see. Do we have a call already with a Sandy question? We do. And it's Danny in Bell Harbor. Danny, you're on the air. Thank you for calling.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Brian. Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning.
I live in Bell Harbor. It's right on the ocean. And I sat through Sandy on my front porch. And the amazing thing about it was that during the storm, when we had up to about 4 feet in the street, the power was still on. And I believe that's what caused all the fires down here. And I was wondering, was there ever an investigation done in regards to the power company?
That's an excellent question. It's actually the first time I've heard it said like that, and I will follow up on that. And Brian, I'll be able to speak to that on the next show. But that's a very, very powerful question. Look, I think one of the things we can say about Sandy, and remember, Sandy was so painful and so extraordinary because it was a hurricane and a nor'easter that hit simultaneously, and there had not been previously a recognition that this could happen all at once, and it could leave us in such a tough situation. I think we learned from Sandy that we have to do a whole host of things differently. We have put in a huge amount of resiliency measures since Sandy. There are many more coming. There's a $20 billion plan for resiliency in the city that's constantly being implemented each day. But we also learned about things like we had to have access to a petroleum supply. We had to have a lot more redundancy in where we had, for example, our generators placed, and other key mechanicals couldn't be in basements where they could be flooded. There's so many lessons that are now being applied all over the city. But that question about how utilities should work strategically in that kind of case, that's a good one. I'll follow up on that.
All right. Sorry, we can't give you a more specific answer. Let's go to our next call. Another Sandy-related call, and let's see who we've got next. Is it Frank in Manhattan? Are you there?
Hello.
Hi, Frank. You're on the air with the mayor.
Yes. Good morning, Mayor de Blasio.
Morning, Frank.
Go ahead, Frank. We got you. Frank, you there?
We're ready, Frank.
Yes, I
Go ahead.
am.
I think that's our problem. We had a little technical problem. I think we have you back. Go ahead, Frank.
Okay. Yes. Good morning, Mr. Mayor. I have a small building in Chelsea that was damaged because of a major sewer backup into living space during Sandy. And I immediately hired, we had close to 2 feet of sewerage in the living space. So I immediately hired the people who have worked for me for the 40-odd years, over the 40-odd years that I have owned the building. And I applied for a building back loan because things are still needing to be done, but the sanitizing and the reconstruction of drywall and all of that has been accomplished. And because I hired these people by the hour and not by contract, and I was on the job with them practically every day, Build It Back wanted to see contracts. I don't have them. They wanted to know what people did every day and every hour, and I did not record that information. I just was there to make sure that they did the work. And as a result of that, some other work that has to be done in the building, Build It Back just does not feel that that is an acceptable way to do this.
Huh. So you're saying they were asking for too much detail in your documentation?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And,
Mr. Mayor, have you heard this complaint before?
No, not this specific one, but I can speak to it broadly. Look, and first of all, we're very happy after the show to get our folks from Build It Back to follow up, but I got to be straightforward with you. I totally understand why someone in the midst of a crisis would go ahead and just get people working and not have contracts and all that. I fully understand as a human being and a homeowner myself. But again, here's where it gets tricky, and we need a kind of more blunt conversation in this city. I'm responsible for the taxpayers' money. I have to be very careful how we use it. And it's not unfair of the government to say, we need to see evidence of what was done and things like contracts to provide the backup that if we're going to give you money, that we know what we're giving you money for and we can document it. By the way, it's also federal money that we have to prove to the federal government we used properly. So I totally relate to the fact that you did what you had to do for your building, and if there's more work to be done, that might be a place where we can get involved. But it's tough to say, hey, I can't prove what happened, but can you give me money anyway? I think that's a tough equation when we're talking about taxpayer money and the need to prove it was used right.
All right.
Used right.
Let's go to some of the members of the audience here in the Greene Space who have questions. And since we couldn't screen our ticket holders for people who had specific Sandy problems, we let people here at the Greene Space file a question about anything. And our first questioner is going to be Jolie from Bushwick, who's down here in the front row. Hi, Jolie.
Hi. Hey, Brian. Long-time listener, first-time viewer.
Yay.
Very witty.
She is a viewer.
She's way ahead of you, Brian. Okay.
So my question for the mayor is, despite efforts towards bail reform, I was wondering why poor people are still being criminalized through supervised release community programs when, in the eyes of the law, they're still considered innocent, and why not eliminate cash bail altogether, at the very least in misdemeanor crimes?
Okay, so we obviously are working on many fronts on bail reform, and we've taken steps already to ensure that people are not kept in jail because there's a small amount of bail that they can't pay. There's obviously alternatives to that. But I'm a little confused by the first part of your question. If someone is on some kind of supervised release, for example, or alternative to incarceration, they're not being criminalized. They're being given some appropriate action they have to take. So I'm confused by that question.
Well, I guess some of the programs are, some of the programs are rehabilitative. It'll be like a community, addiction program, a community supervised, lesson. And so my question about those is, of course, they're better as an alternative to jail, but they're still a form of punishment. Like people who, could face incarceration could miss work to go to one of these programs. They could miss childcare, that kind of thing. So technically it still is punishment. And even though it's better than jail, they're still technically innocent.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with the technically innocent part. If someone gets sentenced to something, it's because there's a belief they did something wrong. Now, look, there are certainly times when we say the fundamental problem, for example, is addiction. We want to make sure it is mandatory then for them to go and get the treatment rather than just let the problem continue, and it might cause criminal activity as a result. So I think I'm interested in your question because I think it cuts against a little bit of the grain of what a lot of people are working on, which is we don't want to see nonviolent offenders in jail or in prison. We want to see them, in fact, in things like drug treatment or other alternatives to incarceration or community service. Obviously, I'm a big believer in our community courts that find all sorts of alternatives. But the notion always is you have to adhere to some kind of program, some kind of approach. You're right if you say, well, wait a minute, can it be constructed in a way that does not stop someone from working or does not cause them to miss childcare? Of course, that should be part of the thought pattern. But the notion of there isn't some kind of mandate, that doesn't make sense to me.
And her other question about why not just do away with bail altogether, which I've heard other people who are policy wonks suggest, except in cases where there's a real demonstrable flight risk or public safety risk?
Well, a couple things. One, I think there's a difference between the low-level bail for nonviolent offenders, where I think there's much more room to either reduce or change the bail process so it's not onerous and it's not the cause for someone to end up in jail. Obviously, that's not what we aspire to do. So I think, if you will, on the lower end of the spectrum, there's a lot of reform we can make, and we have been making some of that already. The higher end of the spectrum, I would disagree. Bail for serious violent crimes plays an important role. In fact, one of the reforms I want to see in Albany is allowing judges to consider more than just flight risk, but also to consider the seriousness of the offense and the criminal history, because we have had instances where very violent people got out and committed more violence. I think the big discussion in this country about ending mass incarceration revolves around the many, many people who did nothing violent. That's where we have huge capacity for reform and change, and we could get so many people out of the jail and prison system. But truly violent offenders, there's definitely a place for bail. In fact, I think we need to give judges more ability to recognize if someone is an immediate danger, not just a flight risk.
Okay, let's go to our next questioner here. Lisa from Nolita. Hi, Lisa. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Good morning, Brian. Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning.
Mr. Mayor, I would like to ask you here in the Greene Space to speak to your ideas on Greene Space in our city. And I come to you specifically asking about the development of the only Greene Space in my underserved neighborhood of Nolita, where we have the Elizabeth Street Garden, which has been proposed for development.
Well, it's not development, it's affordable housing, and it's going to be a mix, and I want you to understand this. It's
Isn't
very,
that a form of development?
Yeah, but I'm sorry, the word development usually connotes private sector, so I want to be very clear. This was a space owned by the city and demarcated for affordable housing. And you know this has been true all over the city. A lot of spaces were meant to be affordable housing. Many were turned into community gardens. We've tried to find some judicious approach to balancing the equation. In this case, it is, I believe, 70 units of senior affordable housing. There's a desperate need, particularly in lower Manhattan, for affordable housing for seniors. Many folks who have been part of this community for decades and decades and want to be able to stay, and given what's happened to the price of housing, won't be able to unless we create affordable housing. But that's also a super valuable public space. So we've tried to do something Solomonic. Half of that space, give or take, half of that space will go for affordable housing. Half will be kept for community public green space. There will still be a green market. There will still be community activities there. We think we can make it work. I understand why people think that's not a perfect solution, but we think it's a fair solution.
Sure. And I do understand, because I am someone who does benefit from affordable housing. I live just up the street in a rent stabilized unit, and I live comfortably and modestly. I'm an artist. So I completely understand the need for affordable housing, and that's what has become a very high-end neighborhood. So I think there's an understanding that maybe we're all living high enough. We don't need the benefits maybe of green space, but it's really a space that's serves so many people from the community, and also really promotes tourism for what is a really hot spot. And I would say that there is another space that has been proposed and is supported by many elected officials and parks and community organizations that would serve many more people who need affordable housing nearby.
Well, again,
so I would just ask you to consider that.
No, it's a fair point. I've heard about an alternative space. What I've heard about so far is a little bit of a mixed bag, but let me just say this. We need all of the above is the truth about affordable housing.
I would agree.
There's an affordable housing crisis, and I appreciate you're asking this obviously in a very balanced manner. You understand because you're in rent-stabilized housing. But I want to emphasize this. There are so many imperatives simultaneously in the city. We have to deal with climate change. We have to deal with income inequality. We have so many things we have to deal with. But this is one of the things I would say kind of cuts through it. We've got to maintain an economically diverse city. If New York City goes the way of many European cities and becomes an elite enclave, and poor folks are pushed out, farther out, farther out. That's the model in Paris and so many other places. It's a destructive model. It goes against our values. I think hardworking people who come from lower Manhattan and become seniors have a right to stay in their community to the ability, the best of our ability to create options for them. I don't want lower Manhattan to be just for well-off people. I want folks in rent-stabilized housing, folks in public housing, folks in affordable housing, and there'll be plenty of well-off folks to go with it too. But that does not negate the need for green space at all. That's why we're going to keep some of that green space, and we'll look for other options for green space as we go along as well.
This is a first, I think, talking about green space and the green space.
Yes,
that was very clever.
It's a big moment.
I would ask you to come visit our green space.
Happily.
See how beautiful it is, and all the listening audience as well.
Happily.
Let's go next to
ElizabethStreetGarden.org. Thank you.
Diana, who is here from East Harlem. Where are you, Diana? Hi.
Good morning. When you think about running for office historically and now leading up to 2017, in the 6 months leading up to running, what percentage of your time will you spend fundraising? And can you think of ways to try to decrease that amount of time?
It's a great question. I can't give you an exact percentage. I mean, obviously, governing is the vast majority of the time, thank God. I mean, look, I think most people who are decent human beings in public life would tell you we would like to spend 0% of our time on fundraising. This system is so broken, there is no word for it. We should have full public financing of elections. It's 2016. This is idiotic. We should have full public financing of elections in this country. And anyone who says, and I hear this criticism all the time, oh, the taxpayers would have to pay. The taxpayers would be, I think, not only believers that getting big money out of politics and actually allowing the political process to be about the issues and putting all that time that goes into fundraising now back into public service, I think the taxpayers would come to the conclusion that's a pretty good deal. And I think taxpayers are wildly frustrated at the amount of money in politics, and especially the effects of the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court. So I'm going to fight for fundamental changes. I think there's a lot needs to change. The city's in better shape on campaign finance reform than most places, but the state of New York is wildly backwards and needs fundamental reform. So I'll fight for those things. But in the meantime, the answer to your question is limited time, thank God, for two reasons. One, there's no choice. Governing has to come first, and I just have to do the best I can with limited time in terms of fundraising. And second, more and more of what we're going to do is grassroots fundraising, house parties in communities, which I've been doing a bunch of already. And we're very proud of the fact we hired a wonderful firm called Revolution, which was Bernie Sanders' digital firm, and they're going to be doing a lot of online fundraising to real people who will give small amounts. Someone said something about $27 once. I don't remember the details. But, we're going to lovingly borrow that model and try and do more and more of our fundraising at the grassroots.
Are you going to place any voluntary restrictions on the upper levels and bundling from big money people or anything like that?
That's already done by our campaign finance law. The most anyone can give in New York City, only individuals can give in New York City, no corporations, no partnerships, only individuals. The maximum any individual can give for the entire cycle, primary and general, is $4,950.
The reason that investigations and stuff are going on has indirectly to do with the fact that people can give to adjacent funds.
Well, not in a mayoral campaign. There's only the mayoral campaign committee.
So one last question about the re-election campaign year next year. I see the New York City Campaign Finance Board Director has left a position that oversees various aspects of the mayoral election, including debates and fundraising rules enforcement and more, and you get to appoint his replacement. Her replacement. Sorry.
Just like the women in the room, to note that. Brian, on January 20th, there's going to be a change. Okay? Maybe you'll be a little more careful with your terminologies then.
Embarrassing, noted.
I'm going to come to Greene Space more often. This is really going well.
And this is not your doing, but the system of the mayor appointing that person seems like a conflict of interest. Any comment on that, and do you have someone in mind of any gender?
Do not have someone in mind yet. That has to be done by December 31st. It's done in consultation with the city council, so that's an important part of the equation. There has to be some real thinking and agreement there. But the history is people, again, I know there's a tremendous and real concern about potential conflicts, and I always say there's a lot of cynicism about the political process, and it's well placed because we've seen so many bad examples of what happens in the political process. But we do not take stock of what's been achieved here in New York City. This place used to be a cesspool of corruption not so long ago. The cleaning up of New York City government has been extraordinary. We have some of the strongest, toughest, best enforced campaign finance laws in the entire country. We have the Conflict of Interest Board, which constantly passes judgment on any potential ethical consideration in city government. We disclose everything you can think of. We're doing disclosure forms all the time on all sorts of things. This is a very clean government, and it's developed over many administrations because a lot of good people fought for those changes. So there's been a tradition with the Campaign Finance Board and the Conflict of Interest Board, even though the mayor appoints people, that the choices have to be above the fray. They have to be people who are recognized as not partisans, but people who will think about the broader public interest. They also have terms that cut across mayoral terms, so they have that independence.
And you'll notice that I said the next chair of any gender, not either gender. So at least I got that right.
Brian, you're so PC today. You're coming back. It's really impressive.
Please thank Mayor de Blasio.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live from the Jerome L. Greene Performance Space here on Varick Street. Coming up next, Joy Ann Reid from MSNBC. Stay with us.